Hello everyone, Reza here. Today we're exploring the Motion Design tool in Unreal Engine, a powerful suite for creating 2D and 3D motion graphics directly inside Unreal Engine. First introduced in Unreal Engine 5.4, formerly known as Project Avalanche, this tool has evolved, and while it's still experimental, it's nearly ready for production. If motion design has felt overwhelming, don't worry. I'll break down the basics in a beginner-friendly way, just like we did with our Niagara system tutorials. Plus, more advanced tutorials will follow. Let's jump right in. Let's pretend I don't know anything about Motion Design tool, so you guys doing this for the first time can follow along. Let's kick off Unreal Engine and go to Film, Video, and let's acknowledge that this Motion Design template is now available where you can bring in the ready-to-go user interface with some elements to play around. We do not want to do that. We're going to start from scratch, and we don't want to confuse anybody with all those bells and whistles that you might see in the template. So I'm going to select a blank clean scene, and I'm going to call that Motion Design. Doesn't matter if you want to bring the starter content with it or not, and create. The first step we want to make every time we start with a brand new scene when we want to work with motion design is to make sure the plugin is enabled. You can either go to Settings, Plugin, or you can go into Edit, Plugin, and just search for Motion Design. I definitely need the Motion Design, which is still in experimental at the time of the recording, and I don't mind bringing the Storm Sync Motion Design Bridge. Very useful in case if you want to share your end result with someone else as a file. You can just share that with that person. That person can actually drag and drop your work into the content drawer. That file gets unpacked and the viewer can actually experiment or see the entire work that you've created. A great way to share your work with others. We're not going to deal with any of these at the moment. We're going to just stay focused with the motion design. Let's restart and see what changes are made into our default user interface. All right, let's quickly have a look. Well, there is not much change right at the beginning. There is no exciting window that we expect to see, but there are some subtle changes, and those changes are going to actually introduce the user interface that you need. The first change is in the mode selection. We have now motion design. So if I go into motion design mode, I get to see some tools, some bells and whistles, some buttons here that seems like they are actually important for the motion design mode. But apart from that, we have motion design in here, which is going to create the motion design scene. It's going to add all the other panels that are useful to us when we work with motion design tool. If I click on that as well, we now have Motion Design Outliner. We have something called Operator Stack. We have the sequencer open to us, as well as the toolbox available. So let's pause really quickly and talk about the user interface and all these panels and windows that got opened. The most obvious one once we changed the mode was the toolbox. And with toolbox, you can create 2D shapes, you can create 3D shapes, you can go to actors and make use of texts, SVG, you can make use of some lights in the future. We'll see how to create those. You can create groups, null actors. They're basically containers that you can put objects in them. groups basically. And these two, cloners and effectors, and they probably carry 60 to 70% of all those cool stuff that you see out there, people playing around with bunch of clones and they change the size and they make the whole scene more interactive. These two play massive role in how motion design gets interactive with final results. We will dedicate a chapter to these two only because, well, they're very special within the toolbox and they carry so much workload and bring so much novelty and interactivity. It's unbelievable. So Toolbox is in charge of generating, modifying, and creating assets when you bring them into the viewport. But that's not just it. We have Editor panel shortcut that gets added into our user interface. And that gives us quick access to essential tools like the operator stack. So if I close this new window and go to operator stack, this will pop up, which by the way, you can dock in anywhere that you feel more comfortable, but by default it shows up here where you can modify the geometry that you create through here, or you can animate them using some animation presets. You can bring some texts and put some presets on them and animate them. You can have 2D shapes, extrude them, bevel them using the modifier. So again, a very useful window by the sound of it. So we have it in the shortcut panel. So editor panel shortcuts. So that's what this is about. The next one is the viewport. And you may think of this as the good old viewport, but you may have noticed that I have this little guy just right under the viewport. And that determines how the actor is going to be presented in the viewport. Do we have grids on them? How are we going to control the visibility, the colors, the alignments, so on and so forth? We will explore that step by step. Then we have the elephant in the room, another outliner, motion design outliner, and that sits right next to the traditional outliner. What is going on with that? So with this outliner, you have persistent level. In the outliner, we do have the main persistent level. If I go ahead and expand that, we get exactly what we see in the outliner. Now, this outliner is pretty useful because first things first, it allows you to filter stuff really quickly. For example, I just want to see the lights, so it's going to remove everything else and allows you to only see the lights. I click on this little down looking arrow to deselect and see everything again, but that is not it. It allows you to see how the group or parent relationship works, which we will have a look at very soon. You can have customizable view settings and drop downs for managing editor and rundown. So you can see we have two visibility modes, one when you're editing and when you're at runtime. We don't have it here. We just have one visibility. So it only makes sense to use this for your motion design work. You have this little color chip where you say, all right, anything light related, can we please make it yellow? So it's a much better indication of what I'm dealing with, the nature of your actors. You can color coordinate that. And of course, we've got this item, which we don't have here, where it says what type of material this has been assigned to. So you can see that this already gives us so much information compared to the normal vanilla traditional dry outliner. So we are going to work with that instead of using the traditional outliner. Well, you may say, is that it? Absolutely not. We have the sequencer and we have this sequence panel which is closed. If I click on it, Look at that. We can have multiple sequencer when we're running or dealing with motion design tool. We can specify which one we are going to play. Are we going to play all simultaneously? We're only going to select and play the selected one and stop all selected one. We can arrange for playback what and when we are going to play back what with some settings, which we will get to very soon. So I'm going to right click. By the way, you can export them as well, which I found really cool. I'm going to delete that. And last but not least, before we finish off the user interface, let's go ahead either in this outliner or in this outliner, it doesn't matter, and have a look at what we have. Now, I really don't want to formulate the way you approach motion design, but one way of doing this is as soon as you enable the plugin, you go ahead and create default. That is going to give you every element that you need to start with motion design. That is 99% of the time is my first step. But the question is, shall we leave these guys here or delete them? What's going on? Well, you need to delete all of it and start fresh with create default. And I explain why. If I click, it says, hang on a second, I would like to populate some stuff here, but seems like you already have them. Tell me what I should be doing. So default scene root, we don't have it here. We don't have it in the motion design outliner, so it's going to create it anyway. It's going to add it. But when it comes to directional light, we already have one here. So it says, you know what? I'm going to replace what you have. I can update what you have with values, and you can specify your target actor here. Same with skylight. I already have one in the scene, so it says, I'm not going to add two skylights. It just doesn't make any sense. I'm going to replace what I have with yours, so you'll end up having one. Or I can keep what you have and update those values that I have specifically for motion design. You don't have post-process volume, so I'm going to create one. You don't have SINO camera, so I'm going to create one. So that's the whole logic behind let's get rid of all of that and let motion design tool create and prepare everything for you. Now, if I go into create default, it says, I don't see anything. That is good. I'm going to create all of this for you, spawn or create on top of your, if I go into motion design, on top of what you see as your persistent level, I have default scene, the bare minimum, which has got the camera. You can see I'm piloting at the moment. I have post-process volume in case if you would like to have glow, bloom, color correct stuff, and the bare minimum with lighting, which is directional light, shines to infinity, and of course skylight to be able to get the information coming from directional light and bounce it off of your model so it looks more natural. These two are the bare minimum in lighting setup. Without skylight, all the shadows are just going to be pitch black, so we need these two to get the ball rolling. In case if you want to get out of this, you can just simply go into camera, go into default viewport to see other things, and when you want to look perpendicular to the camera, you switch back to SINO camera actor that motion design created for us. Now, very quick breakdown of the user interface. Hope it wasn't too much. User interface done. Let's move on to the next chapter. In this chapter, we are going to talk about 2D and 3D shapes. And fairly straightforward, I'm just going to highlight some important properties and attributes, and we're going to move on to next chapters. With 2D actors, you can select them. This grid pops up because in the utility bar, the grid is enabled. So it allows you to navigate where you want to draw. And you have access to individual components to change the shape if you want to, or you can double click on each actor to get the proportionate version. So for the rectangle, you get quad. For ellipse, you get circle. You can recolor directly from here. So I can select this ring and say, you know what, I want this to be red. Or you can select them. You can go into the materials and apply materials here. Material type set to simple. I can assign a material directly. Under simple, we have solid because we can switch that to linear gradient where you get two color chips. The first one is going to represent the top color and the other one represent the bottom color, which by the way, you can also change. And gradient offset, how much of the first color you want to take over in relation to the second color. You also have align actors where you can align actors vertically, horizontally, stack them on top of each other as center, or you can select one actor, go to align and say, stretch that all the way as my backdrop. So you can see how this utility tool, it's so little, yet it gives you so much capabilities. With this guy, any of these simple material types, you can switch to unlit. So it doesn't get light pollution from skylight and directional light, which is extremely useful for 2D motion graphics. So I can select this one and say unlit. And it's going to sort of create that unlit mode in here. I can do the same thing with the backdrop, use unlit, and it's going to remove everything, including drop shadows, which we kind of don't want on the backdrop. So I'm going to leave it as is. Two-sided, it really doesn't matter because we don't have opacity. But on these guys, I want to make sure that unlit is selected, two-sided off. Unlit on torus is selected, two-sided off. We have other 2D graphics as well. I'm going to bring star, and that gives us an excuse to talk about more material types. We have something called asset, which you can actually bring a material directly from your outliner. So let's say I have this gold material. I'm going to go ahead and assign that to my star. You can see I don't have lit unlit mode on this one because again, it's only applicable to the simple. I have another type of material. Let's bring a regular polygon and double click on it to create a proportionate version of it. And that is the material designer, which you do see in the quick access toolbar in here as well. And that is like a mini material creator for you, very similar to what you see in software packages like Substance Painter or Designer, where you can create a PBR material and you can see what channels it will make available. Basically everything PBR related, everything opaque related, everything emissive related, translucent related, including opacity, or everything in one go. So you have access to pretty much all the tabs and you can do ultimate customization over your material. Just to demonstrate for now, we will get into this later, but just to show you, I can just pick emissive and go continue. It gives me the emissive channel, which I can tweak. This is my first layer. I can go into solid color for that layer and say, you know what, make that this color. You can save that as a file to repurpose, or in this case, I have only that and it shows me an emissive material that I created with Material Designer. And you can also click on it, go back to it, change the tiling, look at the channels, or pick another color for this material. Very straightforward, yet incredibly powerful. That's all there is to it for 2D shapes. The only thing that left for me to talk about would be the capabilities when it comes to animation. So if I go into shape, you can see all of these guys have a keyframe icon right next to it. What does this mean? It means that I can actually bring them into the timeline, into my sequencer, and animate them. So if I go into the shape for the stars, I can basically tweak the shape, change the number of points. I can do the same thing, change the number of sides. I can basically go into this guy right here and even add bevel. And all of these are animatable. Let's say I'm going to get rid of this, I'm going to get rid of this, and just that leaves us with this guy, this torus or ring right here to play around with. I'm going to go uniform scale and move this all the way. I'm going to go into inner size and bring this all the way down until we have only 0.01 in the inner size, and I'm going to apply the keyframe. Not only it's going to bring the inner to my sequencer, but also it's going to find what I'm going to animate and apply keyframe in any location that I have my cursor. I'm going to simply hold and drag, move this keyframe to the very first frame, move the time head forward all the way to the end, and I'm going to change the value for my inner size, and it's going to create a 2D wipe for me. After the change is made, click Add Keyframe, and now if I play, I have a 2D wipe. So the animation capabilities in 2D shapes, just incredible. What about 3D shapes? Will that be any different compared to this one right here? Not at all. I'm going to remove that ring from my sequencer, so there is no keyframe, no animation. Get rid of the ring itself, and I'm going to create a 3D sphere. I can go into General and increase its size, not just in X, but all around. Same deal applies. You go into Material, give it a solid color. You can use unlit with solid color, or you can use a gradient and use a secondary gradient in here. So if I go into General and start rotating, you can see the gradient kind of shows up here as well, dealing with the same old same. You do the same thing with torus, you do the same thing with a cone, and you take it from there. The only difference is when you bring a 3D shape with multiple components, like cube. If I bring the cube, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of an angle, not in X, but rather in Z and Y. So I'm going to go to Scale and make it just a tad bigger. Perhaps I'm going to lower my focal length so I don't deal with perspective. And let's apply a simple color. I'm going to go to Simple Color, Red. What is happening? Well, the reason it's happening is because I'm applying this only to one polygon, one face. You can go use single material, and it applies the single material, either it's gradient or just a simple solid color to everything, which might be something that you really like. Or you can say, don't apply it to everything. I want to customize it. And you can see you have access to top. I'm just going to change the secondary color for this one. Then bottom. See how that changes immediately. Back, a different color. Left, I'm going to go with this one. And right, I'm going to go with perhaps this color. Now, if I go to General and start spinning this material, or this object rather, you can see each side gets its own customized material. And that's the power of using 3D, where you want to apply material and you don't want to use a single material to be applied to the object. Again, in terms of the animation side of things, the whole thing applies. I can go in there into the first frame, bevel size to 0. I'm going to go all the way to the finish line and then turn that to a sphere, basically morphing what we're doing. And if I play now, you can see the animation takes place. How cool is that? Now, the utility bar, if you don't want to see that bounding box, you can turn it on and off. If you have multiple objects, like I have this cube right here, and you just want to see what you're working with, you can isolate that, including the background, so you just see the animation right here. You can have a save frame, which we will talk about. Next chapter is for texts, something that is very useful. You can go all the way in and see viewport information, size, visible area, cursor, how much zoom you're using, and you can use snapping. So when you're moving object, it snaps as opposed to freeform translation. All right, that should do it for this section. We now know how to animate 2D and 3D elements. Let's go to the next chapter and explore more. In this chapter, we're going to have a brief look at the text actor, something that motion designers tend to use, bringing letters, numbers, names, logos, digits, so on and so forth. So text actor, again, the grid shows up. You can either place it manually or you can double click on it and bring the text into your level. You can see it drops itself slightly on the right hand side. It's because of the layout, the alignment. So I can go into the layout and say, bring it to the center and align the text also to the center, and it's going to align that for us. The first thing that you usually do is to put text in it, because after all, that's just a placeholder. I'm going to go into the text tab and let's go motion design. And if you enable enforce uppercase, all you see is the uppercase of what you type. You can go into layout again and now play around with kerning. You can totally keyframe it, have everything outside, and single keyframe, move forward and bring it in with a little bit of ease out. That's something that you can do. With line spacing, it's something that you first prepare through text. So I'm going to click after motion design, shift enter to go to the second line. I can type in Unreal Engine. I want to change the type, the font type, based on what you've installed in your computer to Impact is what I have, and it's chunky. I like that. Makes the whole thing far more visible. And now if I go into layout, I can play around with line spacing as well. So out, coming in at the end of your product, something like animating credits, stuff like this. You can also play around with some other stuff like scale proportionally, or have like maxed width, squash everything, revealing your font, again, something that is keyframeable, which we don't want to do right now, but something that is certainly visible. As for coloring, again, more or less, it's going to follow the same rules as 3D shapes and 2D shapes. Instead of having a tab called Material, we have a tab called Style. Does pretty much the same thing. So if I click on it, you have Solid. So you can apply solid color to the mix. I can go in there and give that a very distinctive looking color, something along those lines, and we have that ready to go. Again, if you don't want to see that bounding box, you can always toggle this little guy on and off, or you can press B in your viewport and it's going to toggle this on and off. Now, a cool thing about this is you have another tab called Geometry, and that is going to allow you to extrude your font or your text. So I can go in here and extrude that by 10 units. You may say, where is it? I don't see it. All right, in that case, let's increase its size. Let's actually rotate that just ever so slightly so we can kind of get to see what's going on. And you can see now we have the extrusion. If I go into geometry, I can also add a little bit of bevel into the mix as well. And you can make that bevel half circle, linear, concave, convex, so going inward or going outward. And if you want to see it in 3D, because right now it's more like a unlit situation, if you want to see the font lit, again, you can go to style and it says is unlit, and it's going to turn it off and you see the bevel better. So if I go into geometry now and instead of convex go concave, you see how it's beveling. You can change the bevel profile. You can basically play around with the segments to add smoothness to the bevel as well. And all of these again is going to be keyframeable, which is pretty awesome. Instead of having an extrusion, if you want, you can have just the outline and play around with outline thickness. So if I go into general, bring this guy back, you have a slightly different effect where you just see the outlines and you can basically add materials to the outlines, so on and so forth. So I can go into style and now change that to something like green, and you can see the outline appearing. So much control over what you have. Now I have bevel and I have extrusion. I can color them separately too. So you can see extrude color, bevel color. How cool is that? So you put the text, whatever you want to put. Perhaps I'm just going to leave that as motion design. You go to style and you play around with lit or unlit. Again, I'm going to bring unlit back. I'm going to go into geometry and turn off the outline so I see only the solid version as opposed to the outline version. And now I go into style and start adding other colors, like for example the red, and increasing the value to something like 2 for the beveled areas. And for the beveled portion, perhaps I go with sort of vibrant yellow. And you can see how easily I'm adding color to these guys just like that. If I go into general and again rotate, you can see how those layers have been applied. Red for the extrude, yellow for the bevel, and the actual font is green. In the style, there's a really nifty trick that you can use to make your animation more of a masking, and that is happening through the translucency style. So let's go ahead and change that to a different color, something like that, which is more or less closer to what we have as our backdrop. Let's go in there, and now instead of solid translucency style set to none, I'm going to set that to gradient mask. So left to right or right to left, you pick how smooth is going to be. I'm going to crank it all the way up and look at this slider. So I'm going to keyframe that. I'm going to assign keyframe, mask offset 0, at frame 0. I'm going to go to, I don't know, maybe frame 100. I'm going to set that to 1 and keyframe. And if I play, you can see my font reveals itself. So that's another cool way of masking things, although we have masking in the modifiers and I will talk about it, but it's another way of masking very quickly using mask orientation left to right, right to left, with the help of translucency style. There is really not much to it at this point. Let's leave this at that. And this is easy enough for you guys to play around with. Let's go to the next chapter and talk about animators and modifiers. In this chapter, we are going to talk about animators. Instead of the laborious task of bringing every single element into the sequencer and reveal the transform and keyframe the rotation, the scale, and the translation, we can leave that to the animators in the motion design tool, and it's going to do some automated preset type of animation for us with good degree of control. Obviously, there are times where the animation you want to do cannot be found in the animators dropdown. In that case, you have no choice but to do it manually. But first stop, where to find the animators? It's in the quick access bar operator stack, and we have access to the animators. We have this add animators that reveals all the animators for you. More or less, some of these guys are doing exactly the same thing with few minor changes. So there is no point going through every single one of them. That is going to take perhaps 45 minutes. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to cherry pick few ones, the ones that operate slightly differently, and we get the gist and feel for what animators can do with motion design. So if I go ahead and select bounce, well, we need to have something selected, and I'm going to go with bounce. We get these properties right off the bat. If I collapse the bounce animator, you can see this section pops up, and you can add to the animators stack, but this section is not going to change because this is the global control over any animators that you create. Let's say I'm gonna work with oscillate. Now I have oscillate and bounce, and you can see we have the animator global control stack on top of all of them. Any changes we make here will have an impact on any layer in the stack that we are adding. At any point of time, if you want to delete them, you just go delete. You can also delete the global controls, but next time you open them or add them, that's the first thing you see on top of the layer stack in the animators. And I'm going to explain what these global controls do because they're extremely important. So let's start with bounce, since it's the first one on the list, and you can see basically common attributes once we explain bounce. Now, first things first, it gives us a warning and says, well, what do you want to animate? You want to animate rotation, you want to animate scale, you want to animate translation, what axis you want to animate, give me more information, basically. I'm going to go into linked properties, and that's the first thing you do every time you want to animate anything using animators. You click in here and say location, rotation, scale. If you have texts that I have here right now, then you go into texts, location, rotation, scale. So if you happen to have a 2D sphere in the scene, what you want to focus on would be the first three. If you have texts, what you want to focus on would be anything after that. So text location, text rotation, text scale, and visibility. Since I'm dealing with a text, I'm going to go to text, and I'm going to go into location, and let's say I just want to bounce the location of this font in Z-axis. You may say, okay, what's happening? Well, there is a drop from top to bottom, and the magnitude is going to intensify the effect. So if I go and set that to 2, it's like we're increasing the mass, and it drops further and further with such force. You can change the cycle from loop to only do once, or to do ping pong, which is go up and down, or play that only once. I'm going to set that to loop, and then we have duration cycle. How long this will take per cycle? 1 second or 2 seconds? In that case, it goes out of the picture and it comes back. And how much gap you want to have between each cycle. So if I go 1 second, it's going to wait for 1 second and repeat itself. So you can see, so easy to follow. You can invert the effect, so it goes from bottom to top using the exact same effect, doing a bounce, or top to bottom. And if I go down, you can see I have only one to deal with. And within that one, you have min and max, basically starting point and the end point. So min minus 100, I'm going to set that to minus 50. And you can see where it drops is much higher. If I go to minus 150, it drops a lot lower. So these type of controls are really no-brainer. I can go and get it start to a little bit closer and drop. So that's exactly what you see in here. We've got a magnitude just for the linked property, as opposed to more or less the global that may have an impact on everything. Time offset, you want to, specify a time offset, bit of a pause, let's say half a second, and that is going to have an impact on each letter, and it's going to offset them and create a really cool result. I can go ahead and change the offset min and max to minus 20 and 20, and you can see more or less we're getting a slightly different result using the same process and same principles in the animator. There is really not much in there, and while this global is still there and I am going to explain it, I'm going to go into bounds and I'm going to disable it. Why? Because I just want to add another animator to that. And the other animator is, let's say, curve. And what curve does, it gives you an in and out type of curve, and the animation will take place based on what you specify in curves. So let's explore that one as well, and we can skip a bunch, and they are very similar to these guys. Let's say, for example, I would like to give it an in profile, and for the in profile, I can go in, out, back. And this gives me this really like a sine looking profile. What would be the duration of that? We want to give this a duration of half a second, and that's perhaps more than enough. I'm going to go in here, set that to ping pong, because we want to get to the end and again loop back to the start and get to the end, loop back to the start, and we do cycle duration perhaps to half a second with gap duration of 1 or 2. Now, again, it's going to ask what properties. You just keep tweaking the properties without saying what exactly you want to change. So I'm going to go into text character, location, and I'm going to say, you know what, I'm just going to do that in relative location X. Obviously, we're nowhere near what we want to do. I'm going to put amplitude min to minus 50, max to 0, and this time offset, which is perhaps the most important bit, is here. So before time offset, doesn't make much sense, and after time offset, it's going to give it a ripple letter by letter. I feel like some of these animators honestly work really well with texts, and something like bounce perhaps works better with normal sphere or a star or a cross, stuff like this. So it's just a matter of playing around with these animators to sort of get the sweet spot to see how it works and basically take it from there. Let's do the same thing with this guy as well. So I'm going to go and apply a curve in here. For in, I'm going to again use in, out, back, bring that into the mix, give it a duration of half a second. I want this to be very similar to that one, but once we finish with the animation, we will follow that up with the animation in here, but the reverse direction. So again, loop set to ping pong, cycle duration, I believe I put half a second for this one, so half a second for this one, and cycle gap duration, I'm going to set that to 1. Again, just like before, I'm going to specify what channel I'm going to target. I'm going to target character, location X. I'm going to scroll down once I do that, and you can see, well, it just doesn't know what to do really. So let's go -50 for amplitude min, amplitude max, it's going to be 0. And this time, instead of half, I'm going to go -half a second. And you can see we get this type of animation. So very simple stuff. Now you may say, Reza, it's all good, but it's actually the playing in the viewport in real time. I want to bring it to the sequencer. How will I be able to bring it to the sequencer? And that is the part where the global controllers are going to take effect. So with the global controller, I can say, you know what? You're viewing this in the world mode. How about bring that into a sequencer? We need to create a track. We are going to create a track here, and then it drops itself in the sequencer. I can do the same thing here, go from world into sequencer and create a track, and it brings the second one to the sequencer, same sequencer as well. And now we don't see an animation because the animation is on our sequencer. We play and we see the animation. You may say, Reza, okay, it's all good. How am I going to customize it? Let's say I want to add a little bit of twist. I want a keyframe right here in the middle. Seems like it's just puts everything that I see in the viewport into the sequencer without much extra control. In that case, you go from sequencer into manual. So I'm going to go and set both of them to manual. And every time you switch from sequencer to manual, you get this custom time. And if I scrub through, you can see I'm getting the animation. So I can keyframe now. I'm going to go into frame 0 and apply keyframe. Let's say I want this to happen a lot faster. So in 50 frames, I want to go into 1 keyframe. And if I look at here in the manual portion of my timeline, that's where the animation happens. So I can go here and bam, really, really quick. The first second, it's going to do the trick. You can specify the frame per second in here as well. And you can go into the second one, into manual. Now, if I expand the track, I have this track, which I can move and customize. So I get something like this. So obviously, this is not really that accurate. I need to tweak that, but that's how you actually assign keyframe to these guys and manually tweak certain properties. I'm going to go and deactivate these guys in here and in here. And there is one animator that looks a bit different compared to the rest of them, and that animator is called clock. So let's see how we can try that one out. So I'm going to bring a simple text in here, put that text in my outliner. By the way, if you don't see your motion design outliner, which I always suggest you do, you can go to Windows, Motion Design Outliner, and create one for yourself. Now I have this little guy, this text right here. Let's go into clock. And basically what this one does, it gives you some sort of a countdown in text, and it says, I accept only text. So remember, if you have a sphere or a square or a star, it's not going to accept it. I'm going to go into text, and with that, it starts the clock. Simple as that. Now, you want to customize it? Of course you can. You have access to hour, minute, and second. If I go into linked properties, text, it's already been linked and ready to go. time zone. It looks at the time zone of your computer, and you can customize actually this by removing these two, H and M, and only have S for second. And you can see now what it's displaying is only the second in the viewport. The next one I'm going to talk about is wiggle. So I just removed curve and I'm going to go and add wiggle to the word animator. Obviously, there is no XYZ coordinates. We don't know what we're targeting. So let's go into linked properties. And one thing I forgot to mention, or perhaps jumped over, was this vector right here. You may say, Reza, you talked about XYZ. What is this vector? If you want to bring all three, don't add 3. Bring vector, and it's going to bring X, Y, and Z for you. So I'm just going to select vector. And in here, if I select and have a look, you can see I have X, Y, Z. You're avoiding the clutter. Okay, so amplitude minimum to -5 and a max amplitude to 5. And you can see it's sort of working. We need to up the magnitude and it's going to wiggle. We can go ahead and do character scale, vector. And for the scale, we can set this one to a very low value, perhaps -0.1, -0.1, and -0.1. And you can see we're getting a really stylized looking result. Obviously, I can do the same thing, getting rid of these guys. I'm going to go to animator, and I'm going to bring another wiggle. So this is a really quick look at the animators. You can apply the same principles onto shapes, onto arrows, onto lines, onto triangles, anything that you wish to animate and create preset from. With that out of the way, let's go to the next chapter and talk more about other tools in motion graphics and take things to the next level. Now, in order to close the chapter on the 2D side of things, there are 3 bits that I still need to mention. The first one is the importance of using an anchor, which is a null anchor. This is a way of grouping elements and actors inside your motion design outliner. Let's say I have these 2 texts and I want to translate both of them at the same time using the same value. Instead of moving this one and keyframe and then moving this one and keyframe, I can double click, create a null actor, select the other 2 fonts and drag them into the null actor. Now I have control over both of them and I can actually keyframe them, apply animators to them, keyframe the scale. So if I go in here and keyframe the scale, you can see I can keyframe the scale together. So this null actor is a great way of organizing and animating your actors, especially if they are go together, if they're part of the same category. Use null actors. Obviously you need to rename them properly, so I always start with null followed by the name of the actor or the type of the actor. So that's the first thing, very easy yet extremely useful. The second one is the importance of using modifier mask. So there are times where you want to mask these 2. So you want them to appear, but you don't want to necessarily use the animators. Perhaps you want to get something similar to a normal wipe in Premiere, After Effects, or DaVinci. So if that's what you want to do, you can easily achieve that using a mask. So if I go ahead and create a rectangle, something like this, it's a 2D rectangle and it really doesn't matter what color you give to this. And I'm going to go into modeling, I'm going to go into Xform, edit pivot, and I'm going to move the pivot to the right or perhaps left. Now, when I scale this through general, when I start scaling it in the y-axis, well, this scales it uniformly. So if I go and unlock this padlock and start adding values to my y value, you can see it kind of goes over this font right here. I can totally bring this forward, so I'm just going to see which way will bring this completely forward. Well, turns out -50 will get the job done for me. Now this can be my mask element, and these two and the null node can be my masked element. So there are two masks that you assign. Mask source is the geometry that you're using to mask objects, and the mask target is the one that you want to appear or disappear, your target element. And by adding these two modifiers, you can mask an element. We talked about a different way of masking in the previous chapters, where you set the translucency style to gradient mask. So now I'm turning the mask offset on and off to reveal and to hide objects. That's a valid way of doing it. But if you want to use a traditional mask, you can certainly use that or apply that using modifiers. So I'm going to select this one, give this mask source, and as soon as I do that, it disappears, but it's still there. You can always toggle your mask on and off to see where it's located if you have difficulty seeing it. Now I'm going to go into general, and with my timeline set to 0, I'm going to go and apply keyframe. Now I'm going to go to frame, let's say 100 perhaps, and I'm going to increase the size of this guy maybe to 6.2 and keyframe. So that's what's going to happen with this mask right here. Now I don't need to see that overlay anymore. I can toggle that off. Now all I need to do is to make the null node masked target. Now if I look at this, you can see now my animation will have an impact on the font. Now in the property panel, this base opacity works against your mask. So when it's set to 0, you actually have the mask, but as soon as you increase it, you're starting to reveal it. You can invert the mask, so doing something like this and invert it, revealing the right hand side, this one revealing the left hand side. You can apply blur, and that does exactly what smoothness does in the style. So now it's got a little bit of fade in. You can see you can increase that if you want. You can apply feather to it as well. And that's another way of creating mask. Again, you may prefer to use the internal mask mechanism inside your font, but let's say you want to apply that to a shape. So with this guy, you do have access to this, but if I select a shape, there is no style tab, and you want to use perhaps this modifier source and target instead. Something that is nice to know. Now, the very last one is how you can actually turn your 2D shapes into 3D, again using the modifier. So I'm just going to hide all of these guys. I'm going to hide my mask. I'm even going to select this Unreal Engine logo, and I'm going to hide it. All I have is the backdrop. If I go in there into motion design and just dropping down a rectangle, let's say we're going to create a quad, and I'm going to rescale that quad like so. Now in texts, we have this geometry tab which allows us to extrude stuff, right? In shapes, we don't have that geometry section. And if you want to extrude this 2D shape, you simply use modifiers. So all you see in here reminds me of the modeling tool, as I said before. So you select, you go into extrude, and you start extruding your object. Now if I turn this, you can see I'm applying extrude to that object. You can close the back, or you don't want to close the back, that's totally fine. So that is open. You can fill hole and put the cap and close the object if you want. The rest of them work exactly the same. So if I go into, let's say, wireframe, you can use another modifier to subdivide, and it's going to subdivide that for you. You can specify how many cuts, what resolution you have in mind, and add to the resolution if need be, and it's going to be a uniform for the most part. Again, now with the resolution, you can go ahead and bend if you want to. So I'm going to apply this third modifier, which allows you to bend your object, which you couldn't do previously because there was no resolution. And you take it from there. Really, there is really not much to talk about. If you know the basics of modeling, you should be able to just take it from there and experiment with it. And you can see how modifier works by using what Unreal Engine calls stacks. So putting the modifier stacks on top of each other, and you can just pretty much use that and apply that to your scene. So this planar cut works exactly similar to the planar cut that we have in Unreal Engine modeling tool set. So it's going to cut that, and then you give it a rotation angle, and you basically start completing your own scenario. You can fill hole, and you can invert the cut, so on and so forth. All right, I hope that makes sense. I don't want to spend too much time on something that is just too obvious, but it's good to acknowledge that these set of modifiers are there and are very useful, and you can use that to your own benefit. I'm perhaps going to stop the recording, put something really quick together. We don't want to spend too much time on any case studies. The whole idea is to deliver the basics of motion graphics, and I'll get back to you guys in a second. Now, in between sessions, I spent only 15 minutes putting together this 2D animation. Very simple stuff, but it shows how much potential this tool has. If I only spent 15 minutes with no planning whatsoever, and I can come up with something like this, chances are if you sit down and have a proper plan, put things into storyboard, you can come up with something 10 times better than this. And if I look at the structure, it's really, really simple. I have a simple backdrop with a solid color, and then this line right at the beginning, I translate it in here and scale it, animate, keyframe the scale, and then I create this box, again, keyframe the dimensions on the timeline. And this rectangle is not just a, one unit rectangle, it's got 4 pieces to it. So if I select 1, 2, and 3 and 4, 4 panels that I carefully put right next to each other, and group them as a null. So you have the null actor, you parent all of these 4 into null, and then you animate the null. And for each one of these guys, I applied an animator. And for this one, the animator is bounce, simple, do once on the timeline, which is manual, and I only revealed the location. So as you can see, each one of them will break like that, and each one of these panels will get one animator. Something that simple. And then for the reveal of the font mask, and let's reveal that, it's nothing more than a freehand polygon which I created, and then I animated that across the board. I used modifiers to this, so this is modifier mask source, and the whole thing as a unit, I put it inside this font, so it basically has got not only the font but also the background, all these green panels or cyan looking panels. So that is going to be modify mask target. And then I went over that using the mask capabilities. For these guys, nothing more than a normal circle, and I've gone into shapes and keyframed the angle degree. And as for these stars, they're nothing more than a plus text that I used with the curve animator attached to all of them. So you can see the combination of all of these just in 15 minutes will get you a really satisfying result. Of course, this is nowhere near finish or nothing fancy because I only spent 15 minutes on it, but that showcases how much potential this motion design tool carries even in the 2D domain. Something to think about, and I highly encourage you to play around with it and sort of get comfortable with it and basically have fun. All right, let's go to the next chapter and find out more about this incredible tool. Now that we have covered the UI, the viewport, and the toolbox, let's dive into what truly makes motion design a game changer: cloners and effectors. Motion design seamlessly integrates with powerful Niagara particle system, allowing to generate dynamic motion graphics by cloning and manipulating geometry. With cloners and effectors, tasks like scaling, rotation, positioning, and procedural noise become intuitive, letting you randomize, colorize, and stylize your scenes effortlessly. Let me show you what I mean. Now let's talk about the cloner actor in Unreal Engine. So you find the cloner inside actors and the cloner actor. I'm going to double click on it and it's going to drop itself in my level at the center. I'm going to move it up a little bit in Y-axis, and this cloner actor that you see allows you to create multiple copies of a clone, which in that case is just a normal cube. You can see a static mesh. It's going to create multiple copies of your object and arrange any objects that you assign to the cloner procedurally in different patterns like grid, radial arrays, or even along splines. It's the core component of motion graphics inside Unreal Engine, very similar to MoGraph in Cinema 4D, and it enables designers to animate and manipulate instances efficiently. You can go in there into 3D shapes, select a sphere, and simply left-click, drag and drop it into the cloner, and it's going to make that part of the cloner, and it's going to rearrange it for you automatically. You can go into General when you select the cloner and rotate, move, or scale the entire cloner at once. without rotating any of these individual actors. You can go into the cloner, force the update if something is not happening properly, enable or disable it, or give your cloner a color. And that color will be across the board, and it's going to apply to all of these guys as well. Now, one thing that you need to be very careful about with this color, if you have a material, not a solid color, a proper material assigned to any of these, this color for the cloner is no longer applicable. So that material that you assign to the sphere is going to overwrite the color of this cloner, which, by the way, I think is a new feature. So let's put that into practice. I've got a motion design pack from Pixel Lab, and I highly encourage you to have a look at this. It's got a collection full of materials: glass, subsurface, transmissive, conductive. It's a very comprehensive, ready-to-go materials that you can use. I'm just going to select one. I'm going to assign that to my sphere. So I'm going to go into sphere, into material. You can see the same setup applies. I'm going to go switch from simple to asset, and I'm going to simply assign that to one of the actors. Now, if I go into the cloner and pick a very extreme color like green, you can see it applies to the one without the material, but it's got no effect on the asset with the material applied to it. Something to be mindful of. Then we have the Effector tab, and this Effector tab is incredibly powerful. We will get to that once we talk about cloners. Basically, the effectors are going to disrupt and change the behavior of each clone over time. A great way to create randomness, procedural animation, and interactivity into your cloner. So if you're using cloner, chances are you want to use effectors that come with it. We've got physics, where it looks at the collision. Remember, it's very similar to how Unreal Engine sees Niagara. So if you want to enable some physics, you sure can. For example, I can push this one in. The cloner is now colliding with the surface. I can say, do not collide. And these guys are going to try their best not to have any collision whatsoever. You can do the same thing between actors and say, keep your distance. And it looks at the proximity of each particle, and it's going to put that into practice. For the surface collision, it basically looks at the distance field for each asset, and it's going to rectify the clipping or any collision that may happen. Then we have rendering, where it looks at not only the visual side of things, it allows you to overwrite the material, sort translucent particles, but also it looks at the mesh render mode, which right now is very uniform. If I look around, it's like every other actor is sphere and then cube, very uniform. And that mode is called iterate. I can go into random, and it's going to randomly scatter them across. Very simple stuff, yet very important. And then we have the blend, where it creates the blend between these two actors. So it's going to categorize one actor in one region, and it's going to put the other actor in a separate region within the cloner. Let's go into the cloner because there's a lot to talk about with this particular tab. With this one, the first thing that you need to know about is layout. We've got grid, we have a line, where it looks at the line and sort all of these cloners in a line, either in y-axis, in x-axis, or in Z axis. And of course, you can go ahead and give it a rotation as well. So if I go into Y and go in here, you can see I can rotate that. And just think about the fact that you have the keyframe capabilities for all of these attributes. There's so much potential with what you can do. Then we have circle, and as the name suggests, it's going to create a circle. You can change the scale, you can change the plane like XZ, or the one that we're looking for is YZ, and it gives us the look. You can increase or decrease the number of counts if need be. You can change the radius, make it small or big. Again, animatable, really cool. And you can have start angle and angle ratio. You can give this a ratio like this and animate that. With any of these guys, there are some extra information which we will get to, but I just want to introduce them now. Cylinder is a no-brainer. Obviously, it tries to create the cylinder. We've got the base and then height count. It basically gives you a cylinder, as you can see. Then you have sphere uniform and honeycomb. Again, these are different types of distribution. As you can see, you can pick a plane, fix the counting. You can bring a mesh if you want to. So if you have an actor in the scene, you can use the color picker and bring that into the mix and use that as your nominated particle. You may have noticed that we can only accept static mesh and skeletal mesh. We cannot bring any dynamic mesh into the mix. So we will explore that when we deal with fonts. You have to be very careful. There is a little bit of issue when we deal with fonts along with the cloner. So that's something to think about and talk about. You can bring your cloner along a path, along a spline. So let's say I'm going to go into actor. I'm going to go to spline actor and drop one in. I'm going to press Q to deselect, select one of these points, delete, select the other point, right click, go into spline generation panel and pick circle. I'm going to go into here and reset all the settings and make this slightly bigger. And then I'm going to go into the cloner with the spline selected. I can go and pick the only spline that is available there. If you feel like the size is the issue, you can scale them like so. Go into cube and scale this one as well, just to prove that they're all following the path. So as you can see, it's fairly straightforward. There's nothing complex about that, yet it's extremely fun to play around with. Before we get into effectors, there are a few bits and pieces that I would like to clarify. First thing is when you're choosing a grid layout. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this default clone. You can either delete it or move it out. In that case, it will become visible. I'm going to make it invisible both in runtime and in the edit mode. So if I go into cloner and increase the number of clones, let's say I'm going to go 10 by 10 by 10, come up with something massive. And in order to see, I'm going to go either make the sphere smaller and reduce the gap, or you can go to the actual cloner and make the cloner smaller, something like that, right? So that's what we have. I'm going to push that back ever so slightly so we get to see the front a little bit better. Let's talk about a feature that is only available inside the grid, and that is constraint. So constraint is going to force your cloner to fall into a particular region. And it's going to empty out the surrounding region. That region can be a form of a sphere. You can see I'm now generating a sphere, and it doesn't matter how much I add to the count, it's going to respect that sphere volume. The next one in the constraint domain is cylinder, and it's going to give us a cylinder looking shape. Basically, it's going to force the cloner to only form a cylinder looking shape. Next one on the list is texture, which is pretty cool. I can have a black and white texture, and yes, it kind of needs to be black and white because the white area stays, the black area will get removed, and I click on it, and I perhaps need to look at it from the top, or instead of doing that, I'm going to rotate my cloner, and I'm going to do something like that. Then I'm going to go into the cloner and increase the number of cloners. So I'm going to go 50, 50, and 1, and make the cloner even smaller. And you can see it tries its best to replicate the texture that I assigned to the constraint. That is actually really cool, and you can get that level of randomization by the next rollout, and that is range. So if I collapse constraint and go to range, enable the range, that is in charge of giving you chaos or disruption. For example, if I select the y-axis in the offset max, I can just randomize that. So starting with nothing and everything come together. And again, that is keyframeable. Really cool stuff. Can doing this from z-axis, the camera point of view, and I can doing this in x as well, and using not only translation but also rotation and scale. So these two, range and constraint, are extremely powerful. We do have range in other layouts, but we don't have constraint in other layouts. Only grid has one. So if I go into circle, you can see I have range, but there is no constraint in there. Something to be mindful of. All right, now we know what's going on. Perhaps something in range is off. Okay. So now we know what cloners do. Let's go ahead and have a look at the effectors. I'm going to reset everything back to where it was, and we're going to start over, this time using effectors inside the cloners. What I have in the scene is fairly basic. I brought a default cloner actor with the default clone cube assigned to the cloner, and we are ready to experiment with effectors. If I go into the cloner, effector was the only tab that we didn't discuss, and now it's time to talk about the power of effectors within the cloner system. There are two ways to create the effector actor. One is to double-click on the effector actor, create it in here, and manually link that to your cloner. The other way of doing this is to create the effector within the cloner, and by default, it will be already linked. So let's explore both methods. I'm going to go and select the cloner, go to the effector. Let's say we already created the effector using the effector actor button here. All you need to do is to go into array elements, click on this plus button and say, do we have any effector in the scene? Yes, we do. As soon as I click on it, it will get linked to the cloner. So now the effector is linked to the cloner. That's first way of doing it. I'm going to go ahead and click on this remove all elements. The second way, as you can see, is to create link effector directly within the cloner. I click on that and it creates the secondary effector, and that is now linked to the cloner. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the old one, so I have just one effector to have a look at. Now, you may have noticed a change right away, and that is the red color in here, which I didn't have before. This red color is the area that the effector is working with. You may say, well, why it's red? Because by default, if I go into the effector, the color is red. I can go ahead and change that to a different color, and you can see the effect of the effector within the cloner. And now the only thing we see is actually the color, but no other procedural animation or transformation. Now, before I get too excited with that effector, I'm just going to go ahead and have a little bit of fun with this cloner and replace these cubes with something more interesting. I'm just going to go into shape and perhaps replace the cube with a cone. I'm going to drag and drop the cone. Obviously, the mode is set to iterate. So Unreal Engine and the motion design tool is going to combine these two. I'm going to select the default clone and remove it. It says, well, that is part of your cloner. Are you sure? We are sure. So let's go and change the distribution of our cloner. First things first, I'm going to go to the cone itself and reduce its size to something like 0.1. I want to make it super small. I'm going to go into the cloner to clone, and with the grid selected as my layout, I'm going to reduce their spacing. 10 by 10, and I don't need Z count, and instead of 3, why don't I go with something more interesting like 100 and 100. Let's see if there's any gap in there. Well, seems like I'm pretty on target with the count and everything. Looks really cool. I'm gonna go to clone and perhaps give it a material. Something like dark pink or purple should get the job done. Now we have that. I'm going to press G and perhaps move these guys a little bit backward and in Z axis, so we get slightly better lighting and no artifact whatsoever. That should do it. Pressing G to hide. And now we clearly see the cloner and the effector. Now, when you're working with effector, you can have just the effector to do the effect, or you can parent that effector to a geometry as if the geometry is doing those transformation to your cloner. That's another trick you can use to your advantage. So I have a platonic solid that I simply made in Autodesk Maya. The reason I'm showing you this is just to also let you know that you can potentially use other static assets as well. I'm just going to drag and drop it. I'm going to centralize it and move it up. We have that static mesh visible in the scene. Perhaps I'm going to increase its size. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to make the effector part of the platonic solid. So dragging and dropping on top of my static mesh. You know, these tricks are kind of cheap tricks, but you definitely can put those into practice if you want and benefit from them. We know that the effector is linked to the cloner. So now with that out of the way, let's discuss what we can do with this effector. We talked about the color, so I can give it a slightly different color. I can activate or deactivate, and I can reduce the magnitude, so the intensity of the effector. If I put 2 in there, you can see I cannot go above 1. So keep that in mind. You've got a range between 0 to 1 to intensify the effect, whether you want it or not. And the default is set to full strength. Now, there is really not much there in the effector side of things, just the color and enabling, disabling along with magnitude. We have forces, mode, and shape. I'm going to start with mode. And the first thing we have is mode set to offset. So mode is basically saying, how would you like to influence cloned object within the cloner system? The first one is by repositioning, rotating, or scaling your particles or your cloned objects. So if I go in here and start raising this area, you can see that my platonic solid is now causing this bulge because, well, I set the effector to offset. It's going to offset the translation for me. I can select the effector and say, why don't you rotate the cones in 90 degree, minus 90 in Z and 90 in Y. If I select the platonic solid, you can see it's now affecting the rotation of these cloned objects as well. If I select the effector and reduce the scale to something like 0.1 to make them almost disappear, you can see now this effector by itself is going to do it, but also platonic solid is kind of like causing this distortion to happen. Yeah, you may have noticed that the effect that I'm creating is in a form of a sphere. It's not a cube, it's not a cone, it's not a torus, it's a sphere. And that takes me to the shape tab. The reason you see sphere, because sphere has been specified as my shape. It's set to linear as the ease in, which is the profile. I can go and change that to, let's say, in out quart, and you can see the profile of the raised area will change based upon anything that I pick, which makes it a lot easier for you to tweak things around if need be. There are some really cool ones here, like this one, which is causing more like a noise or ripple effect in the background. If I select the platonic solid, it creates a ripple and you move the objects in and out. So you can already see how powerful these two tabs are and what sort of effect you can create. Now you may say, Reza, this platonic solid, or your effector rather, it's not too big. Why it's causing the distortion to this amount of cloned object? In the same tab, shape, we have inner radius and outer radius, and that defines how far you want the cloned objects to be affected. You want to go beyond that, and that is going to create a massive wave. I can select the platonic solid, and you can see it's created a massive ripple effect. Or you want to make it super small and rather rigid. What I usually do, I lower the inner radius to something really low and upper the outer radius to exaggerate. And with that, you get a really soft effect. So if I select the platonic solid, you can see the effect is rather smooth. So if you want to get a smooth effect, make the gap high. Whereas if I set this one to 50 and give it the same value of outer radius, the effect is going to be really harsh. I'm going to select the effector and make this radius 200 and 200. Now it's more exaggerated. You can see what's going on. It's really solid and harsh. So in a nutshell, that's what these two tabs do. I'm going to go and switch this one to something like 50 and this one to 300 to go back to the smoothness of the effector. And let's talk about more modes and more shapes within the effector. I'm going to go into mode, and from offset, I switch to target. As soon as I switch to target, the fall off is gone. Well, we still have the same shape. That's why you see that ripple effect here. But now target asks for an object. So I can select my picker and say, I want this to be the target. Now, this platonic solid is actually causing the distortion. You can see that one really cool thing that target does, it kind of direct clones to orient or position themselves towards the specific target object. It's relative to specific target objects, and perhaps that's why I chose cone, because that pointy shape of the cone allows us to kind of see exactly how this works. So you won't be able to push the particles or cloned object or distort them in any form of shape, but you create that gravitating towards the target type of effect. And you can see as I move it, I see the result. What are the other modes that we can have a look at? The next one is noise. And that's a very unique type of mode within the effector, because for that I can easily sort of unparent the effector. It can work autonomously. You don't need to have that platonic solid. I'm going to hide this. Now I'm gonna switch back to shape. Noise works best with a different type of shape, and that shape is called unbound. I can now start generating noise, and because my shape is set to unbound, it's going to happen to the entire cloner system, not just a sphere fall off or a cylindrical looking fall off or a torus fall off. I'm going to put 20, 20, and 20, and you can see already we're generating some waves, some noise. You can actually play around with rotation if you want. So 25 and 25 to get an ideal result. And you can change the frequency from 5 to something really low, so we get bigger waves, or to something really high, which we get smaller waves, like so. I'm going to go and set that to something like 5. And if you feel like you need more clones in your cloner, feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to bump it up to maybe 150 to 150, and I'm going to sort of reduce the spacing to 5. More like a DNA looking type of shape. Now you may say, well, it's still static, Reza. Can we somehow animate this pattern? Absolutely. Using pan, you can start animating your noise. The lower the value, the slower it moves. The higher the value, the faster the animation goes. So let's start with something rather slow. I'm going to set the pan 0.5 to X, 0.5 to Y, and 0.5 to Z. And you can see we can get a really mesmerizing looking type of effect in no time. If you want to make it faster, you increase the value. 1, 1, 1, and you can see the wave is now much, much faster. If you want to lower the height of these waves in Z-axis, all you need to do is to bring the location down to something like 10, and you get more or less a flat result. So really cool type of effects with only few clicks and adjusting a few attributes, and you get to see the magic takes place before your eyes. So that is noise. Obviously, you can use noise in conjunction with a different type of fall off or shape. So you can say, I want this effect takes place only within a sphere. And you can see only the area that we specify as our region, the effect takes place. Right? Really straightforward. We have different types of shapes, which we will get to in a second, but I just wanted to explain noise. Now I'm going to set that to offset again. I'm going to bring the effector and make this part of the platonic solid and make the platonic solid visible in the editing mode. I'm going to reset all of these guys, and let's explore other types, other shapes. Another shape that you have is plane. So that is going to give you a plane. I can hold or press G rather to see the plane. It's really fainted looking type of plane. In previous versions we had like a bounding box, but now that is gone. I'm not sure if you get to see that plane. It's really, really faint. Even I barely can see it. I can zoom in. One side is blue, the other side is red. But basically what this does, if I select the platonic, you can actually change the translation. Right now it's only changing the color because the color of my clone system and the color of the effector are two different colors. That's why you only see the color, but I can easily go into, let's say, mode, offset, and start messing with these attributes. Now I'm tweaking the scale value. So now if I move it, not only I change the color, but also I'm affecting the scale value. Just like before in the shape, you can always benefit from the plane spacing. So you can increase the fall off just like sphere and get a much smoother result. We have, apart from plane and sphere, we have a box, and that is literally a 3D box that you can move up and down and you see the effect. What goes really well with the box in the mode is push mode. It pushes the particles in and out. Now with push, there are few modes or directions. Forward, which moves or pushes the particles forward, pushes them on the right hand side, pushes them up. So you can see it pushes the particles up, which is more or less like offset. But one interesting one that I really like is effector. So effector is actually going to carve out an area and create a hole for your effector to pass across. So that's a really, really cool type of effect that you can get in not just box, but also sphere as well. So I'm going to reduce inner radius value, and we can now see the effect taking place. I believe push is a new mode in Unreal Engine 5.5. I don't remember seeing that in 5.4. So that's really cool that we have also as part of our mode, which is pretty cool. We have two more type of shapes to work with. The first one is radial, and this is more of a no-brainer. As you can see, I can change the radial angle, and it's going to have an impact on the particles and the clone system. Remember, all of these properties are keyframeable. I can keyframe them, bring them into the sequencer. And of course, another obvious one would be torus. You can see the torus is ginormous right now. So I'm going to squeeze that in, create a slightly smaller radius for torus radius, and make that even smaller for my inner radius. Now if I select the platonic solid and push that in, you can see the same settings that we applied to offset is still valid. So scaling to 0, perhaps I can raise ever so slightly as well to make the effect more noticeable. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same thing, just in a form of a torus. Now there's only one tab left to talk about, and that is force. I can enable force, but you have to be extremely careful with force. I've had cases where Unreal Engine crashed as soon as I turned these forces on and off. I had cases where I felt like I didn't have enough control over the force, although in 5.5 more properties per force has been added, so you have just a little bit amount of control over it, whereas in the past it was just a tick box that you could turn on and off. And I looked at it, I was like, nope, that's not for me. But right now, you have just a little bit of control over it. Let's start with, let's say, curl noise, which creates chaos. Now, these guys are going to take place on each particle and push the particles around. You can use gravity, you can use drag, you can use curl noise. So if I start with curl noise and zoom in, you can see those guys are starting shooting up. And we still see the area that's been affected by our effector, but that is no longer sort of active. Everything will get controlled by forces. So they're shooting up like this. You can accompany this with a drag force, which is going to tame the movement. So I'm going to put linear set to 1, which is a very high number, and that should make the movements really slow. And you can see they're flying out, moving out procedurally. You can give this direction, attraction force, gravity force. For example, I can set this to gravity force, and the default -980 is far too high, setting up to something like -50 or even -25, and you start getting to some interesting results, as you can see here. So that's what force is about. It creates animation based on the force field that you guys adjust and tweak, and you take that from there. The only part that is left for me to talk about is the cloner material. Well, let's start with the platonic solid. I'm just going to create a material designer. What I'm trying to achieve here is, and I get that question a lot, can we change the color of the impacted area? Right now, this color is purely controlled by the effector color, which is fine and may work to your advantage. But let's say you want to make the contacted area glow, for example. Right now, with this limitation that you have only color, that is not quite possible. So let's see how we can get that one done. I'm going to go into Platonic Solid. I'm going to create something really simple, maybe a metallic, chromy looking material with an interesting looking normal map on top of it. So I'm going to pick PBR. I'm going to go continue. That is going to open this material designer for me. I'm going to move that to the side so we see what we're dealing with. I'm going to zoom in. The first one is base color. Right now, a checkerboard, as you can see, as a texture has been assigned to my Platonic Solid. I'm going to right click on the color chip and I go solid color. I'm going to give this a color, perhaps a bluish type of color. Next is roughness. Again, a default grayish looking color has been assigned to my roughness. I would like to control that. Solid with roughness set to solid color. Black means zero roughness, super shiny, and white means super rough. I'm going to bring it to this so I get a little bit of blur on the edges. It's not like mirror. I'm going to go into metallic, doing the same thing right now. A black texture has been assigned to my metallic. I'm going to break that. Going to go into solid. Now with that color, you can see that white is completely metallic and black is plastic. Although I always suggest not to do this, I'm doing this myself. I feel weird, but I pick something in the middle just for the look of that. So maybe something like that will get the job done. And as for normal, I'm going to go and pick a more interesting normal. I believe there's one in there called rock. So rock, sandstone, something like that. The intensity of it is a bit too high. So I'm going to go into channel and lower the intensity of that. So channel is in charge of the amount of intensity. Sorry, I'm doing this on the base color. What are you doing, Reza? Doing this on the normal map. So 0.4 will get the job done. And in case if you want to change tiling, you can go into global settings and change the global tiling from here. Either make it slightly bigger or smaller, up to you. So I'm going to put something like 0.58 and that should really do it for this Platonic Solid. I don't want to spend too much time on it. You can always save that as a file and apply that file to other objects if need be. But for now, this will get the job done. That is just a cosmetic change. It has no impact on what we're trying to achieve whatsoever. What we're trying to do is to change that blue color and perhaps some surrounding colors with a different material. So to do that, I need to go into the cloner and target this clone object. More importantly, I need to switch my primary material type to asset so I can import a material and attach that to my primary material asset. So I'm going to go in there and jump out of that, go into a brand new material. I'm going to call that mm_effector. Double click on it, dock that, and let's zoom in and bring that into the better position. So all I need at this point is perhaps base color and emissive. The base color can be, let's say, orange, and apply that to my base color. For my emissive, I'm going to create another 3 vector, holding down 3, left click, and let's give that a color, and that can be more on the orangey looking side. I would like to intensify that a little bit, so I'm going to hold down M and multiply that. So that's going to be my multiplier. Just one simple constant will get the job done. So simple constant, and I can set that to maybe 2. And then I'm going to lerp that. So linear interpolate, holding down L, left click will bring the linear interpolate, and that goes into B, and it actually reads the A from the base color. Now there's a new function that has been added to Unreal Engine 5.5, and that is the clone effector parameter that you can now assign to alpha, and that goes into your emissive. Now this little guy can be a texture, and you can have texture coordinates, take care of the tilings. So any of these guys can actually be an image or texture sample if you want to. But that really should do the trick. I'm going to increase that value to something like 5. So just to recap, this yellow color is going to be the color of these cones. Why don't I match that color actually? So I can just pick a pale dark pink color. So this more or less is going to match what we have here. And then once the radius, the outer radius of our effector collides with the cones, we switch to this color with the high degree of intensity, and this clone effector will going to help us to expose this color upon collision. So what I can do is I can move this guy up a little. I perhaps tweak that a little bit, go to the effector and into shape, and just change the inner and outer radius ever so slightly, moving the effector kind of more or less around the center of my collision object to sort of prepare for it. Now, if I go ahead and select the cone, we do have a material asset which we need to now replace with what we just made. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go into my level, selecting the material that I have in content drawer and assign. So now the new material has been assigned, moment of truth. If I select my collision and bring that in, you can see as soon as the outer radius collides, they are going to change color. To make the effect more pronounced, I can always go into post-process, enable bloom, so increasing bloom to a higher number, something like 2, and I can perhaps go to convolution scatter and set that to 2 also. I can perhaps bump that up to 5. So that's a very sort of simple example of how something like that can be achieved. Let's go to a quick case study in the next chapter. That would be our final chapter, and learn a thing or two about how to use cloners and effectors in conjunction with texts. Alright, in this final chapter, we are going to talk about how we associate text actors with cloners and effectors, because, well, there are a few steps that you need to take in order to get that up and running and working. Now, if I go in the cloner tab under layout and look for layout types, we have a mesh here. And if I select this mesh, it actually asks for either a static mesh or a skeletal mesh. And that can be a problem, because when you create a text, this text is not a static mesh. So let's see how we can deal with that issue and how we can combine those two so they work together. And that would be our case study for this final chapter. First things first, I'm just going to go to layout and realign to the center and top. And I'm going to increase the size of our text, maybe something like 10 will get the job done. And then I'm going to go into, of course, text and type in something. I'm going to put down my name, Reza, right? Let's go ahead and select a font. I'm going to go into layout and just add to the kerning ever so slightly, maybe something like 2.3, so these letters are not too close to each other. As for the cloner, we want the entire text to be replaced by a mesh. It can be any type of mesh. I can go to 3D shapes and perhaps pick sphere and drag and drop it into the cloner. So for the cloner, we're only going to see spheres populating, not the cubes. So if I zoom in, you can see I have the sphere right in front of us. The reason we just see one sphere is because I changed the type of the layout to mesh, and so far we haven't assigned any mesh to it. If I go to grid, chances are we should be able to see something properly. Now, if I go and switch back to mesh under layout, the problem is if I select the picker and select our text, because it's not a static mesh, it's not going to populate our cloner object across the board. So we need to find a way to convert that text into a static mesh. You can easily do that in the modeling toolset, and I talked about this in my modeling video on this channel, but just be careful, because once you convert your text into static mesh, there is kind of no way back. You cannot go into the text field anymore and replace that Reza with something else and expect that to be updated. Static mesh is baked and it won't be changing anymore. So first step is to make sure that this is exactly what you want to have on your level. And once that's confirmed, then you can easily select your text. You go into modeling, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of real estate. By the way, if modeling is not showing up, make sure your modeling plugin is enabled, and then Shift 5 to switch to modeling mode. And if I go into Xform, I should be able to access convert. And what it asks is, would you like to convert this text into a static mesh? Of course, you can convert it into a volume or dynamic mesh, but now we want to have static mesh because that's what the layout of the cloner expects to receive. We are going to say accept. Now, as for each letter, we are going to get a separate static mesh. From here, you have two options. Either select all of them and make them a parent of a null actor, and then apply the cloner to the null actor, right? That's one way of doing it. Or my preferred method is to combine them together and have one static mesh representing everything. Under the same right-hand side menu, transforms and conversions, we have also merge. With all of these individual components selected, I'm going to go to merge, and you can name this. So SM underscore text. You have an option to replace these four components with a brand new static mesh. In that case, the default mode, handle input, delete input is selected, and that is correct. If you wish to keep the input, basically keeping all these four components as well as the new static mesh, you can set that to keep input or hide input. I don't need these four components once they combine, so I'm going to set that to delete inputs, and we are going to press accept. Now I have a brand new static mesh called SM text, and I should be able to hit the ground running with mesh and just select my mesh and expect to see some decent result. However, because the sample data goes to either vertices and triangles, I need to have a decent resolution. I can bump it up to 500 and you can see we have a bit of density in here and pretty much nothing here. If I inspect everything in wireframe, you will soon understand why. I'm going to reset the property value to look at the resolution. You can see we have high density areas in here for the letter R and close to no density for E, Z, and A. So we need to subdivide this and remesh this. With texts, you can go into operator stack and add a subdivide modifier into your text, but all it's going to do is going to make the dense areas even denser and add resolution to low density areas. Still, you have that unbalanced type of subdivision. Nothing is evenly distributed across the board. Luckily, in the same modeling tool set, if I go into mesh, we have access to remesh. We can downres or upres any static mesh. So if I click on that, you can see even distribution across the board. I'm going to specify 5,000 and I'm going to make sure that uniform is selected. I believe uniform is not the default, and the rest can stay the same. Now we have evenly distributed resolution across the board. We can go ahead and accept. Visually speaking, there is no change to our text, but behind the scene, cloners find it a lot easier to attach themselves to nearest areas, either triangles or vertices. Now, if I go ahead and resample, either select it from this drop down or get it from this pick actor, I'm going to go and use the drop down and select SM text. You can see we have more or less a good distribution across the board. I can bump it up, let's say to 1,000 or maybe 3,000. Now everything is covered with spheres that we picked as our cloner. I can put a lower value for our scale so it's not really too jarring, maybe 0.25, and I believe the number that I specified, 3,000, is a bit too high. It's up to your artistic decision, but let's leave it at that and we take it from there. From this point onward, I can go ahead and hide this text in runtime and in edit mode. We don't need that anymore. Now I can go ahead and apply effectors to this. But before I do that, why don't I go into content drawer, or I have that open, the same material that we used for our collision chapter to change the colors of the collision objects once they hit the effectors. We can pretty much use the same concept. I'm going to hold down one single click and create a roughness value for that, perhaps 0.3. I can go ahead and perhaps change this color to maybe dark brown, something along those lines. I can even make it slightly darker and bring a little bit of red to it as well. And save. And I can simply assign that as our material. So Effector has now been assigned. One thing left, and that is to actually generate the effector. I'm going to go to Effector. Since we haven't made that effector manually through actors, we can actually create and link the effector internally within the cloner. We explained that already. So I'm going to click on create link effector, and it's going to give us an effector to work with. The color of the effector is red. I'm going to really quickly check the sphere because I believe yes. So I applied the material to the text, but remember, we're not using the text, we're using the sphere in the cloner. So I'm going to quickly switch from simple to asset and making sure the material is selected, and I am going to apply that to our spheres, and we immediately get the result. Now the setting for our effector, if I go into mode, is set to offset, and the shape is set to sphere, and that's why we see the sphere. Why don't we change that to a plane so we get this type of effect? You can play around with the fall off or the smoothness. I'm going to set the smoothness to perhaps 350 to get a little bit of fall off coming through as well, which would be really nice. For the profile and the easing, you can go ahead and choose whatever you want to choose. So I'm going to choose something with a little bit of in and out. So in, out, exponential. So we have the glow and it's gradually heating up. That looks really nice. So that's for the movement and the behavior of the effector in shape. So what about mode? For mode, the one that we haven't tried yet would be noise in conjunction with shape, set to something like plane, not unbound, because in the previous chapter we tried it with unbound shape. Let's try it with a proper shape like plane. And I'm going to make some adjustments, like for example, for strength, I'm going to pick 5, 5, 5 in XYZ. For the size, I want these guys to shrink once they get in contact with my effector. So perhaps 0.1, 0.1, and 0.1. And of course, I want them to be animated. So maybe 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. Again, lower value in pan means slow movement. I'm going to increase the frequency, the wavelength, so we get more jitteriness along the way. Let's give that a try. And you can see how this disintegrates the font. Looks really cool. You can combine that with forces. So if you want them to shoot up or to move up, you can enable forces. And you can say, well, I would like to have gravity, but I want it to move up, not to fall down. So maybe 10 plus 10, and you can see gradually but surely they start moving up, but it's going to be very uniform. So let's have a look. It's going to happen uniformly. So what I can do is to add a little bit of curl noise. So 100 is insanely high. I would do maybe 15 to start with, and frequency of 10. I'm going to switch back to 5 to get broader strokes, not smaller strokes. And let's have a look. Yep, they're moving up and disintegrating. And remember, all of these are keyframeable. So I can actually reduce the gravity once they go up, right? I can keyframe that in the outliner and in the sequencer and basically get the ideal result that I want. That should be really it for this chapter. Thank you so much for staying with me for this rather long tutorial. I wanted to go over all the basics we haven't had a chance to talk about anything too complex yet, because I wanted to make sure that you get all the benefits of understanding the fundamentals before you have a deep dive into a more complex examples. But I truly hope you found it useful. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you go, and if you wish to see more tutorials like this in the near future, when I experiment with more intermediate and advanced techniques in motion design. And of course, I'm always thankful for your support. As usual, you can follow me on Twitter or X, Reddit, and Instagram. I put the link in the description. And for supporting this channel, you can always use Patreon. Have a great rest of your day, and until the next video, see you guys later.